That's Jeremy Schaap reporting. Let's bring in some gentlemen to talk about it. Tom "Satch" Sanders won 8 championship rings in his 13 seasons with the Boston Celtics, not to be confused with the original Celtics, by the way. He then went on to coach Harvard University before returning to the Celtics as a coach. Mark Moore is an historian who has studied the Black Fives extensively. He's also the descendant of a Black Fives player, Ferdinand Acoo. And you know Dr. Richard Lapchick, who's joined us many times as a professor at the University of Central Florida and the director for the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sports, is also here today as the son of legendary Knicks coach Joe Lapchick, who you heard about in that story, played against the Black Fives. Richard, first off, why don't we know more about these guys in this era?
Well, you know, when I was growing up, people would say to me, your father played on the greatest team of all time, meaning the Celtics, and my father would always pull me aside and say, but there was this team, the Wrens. They could beat us even. And so I was raised knowing that, but I knew the general public didn't know it. It's just like a lot of black history that didn't get written about. We didn't find out about it until many years afterwards, and it was a terrible loss, of course.
Yeah, Tom, he just mentioned, Richard just mentioned the Wrens, that famed team from Harlem. You grew up in Harlem. You knew some of those guys. What did they teach you?
Well, I had the pleasure of certainly knowing guys like Pop Gates and John Isaacs and Sonny Woods. It was interesting because those gentlemen were certainly a bit past their prime upon my growing up, but they were there in the parks, the recreation areas, helping young players find their way as far as basketball was concerned. They didn't exactly compliment us. They were pretty harsh critics. Come here, big dummy, sit down. Let me tell you what you should be doing. Those were the kinds of comments. But it was, yes, Mr. Isaac, yes, Mr. Gates, you know, yes, Mr. Woods. We were always happy when they took an interest in our games and what we were doing on the court and even off the court. These gentlemen had a lot to share.
It's an incredible legacy that team had. We heard about their record during that piece. The entire team was enshrined into the NBA Hall of Fame, National Basketball Hall of Fame in 1963. But how good were they? The legendary John Wooden himself played against them. And he had this quote several years ago when asked about him. He said, "To this day, I have never seen a team play better basketball. They had great athletes, but they weren't as impressive as their team play. The way they handled and passed the ball was just amazing to me then, and I believed it would be today." And of course, John Wooden was a member of another barnstorming team, the Indianapolis Kotskis. They played in the 1930s. Mark, you're the descendant of a player who was not with the Wrens, but was part of that whole circuit. What do you know about Ferdinand Acoo's life in those years?
Well, he was the first member of the first all-black pay-for-play team, which were the New York All-Stars. Now, this team was controversial because before then, no black player and very few even white players had teams where they played for money. Basically, it was since the basketball was kind of established out of the YMCA tradition, it was seen that it should be amateur instead of pay-for-play. But Ferdinand was the founding member of the New York All-Stars, which was the first black pay-for-play team in the country. This was back in 1910, so today is the 100-year anniversary of the New York Stars All-Star team. Actually, he also was a member of the first independent, formally organized independent black basketball team, period, in 1906 called the Smart Set team, which also had Edwin Horn, who was Lena Horne's father, and Charles Scott Ryan, who was the grandson of Samuel Scott Ryan, a famous inventor. And these families actually intermarried. My ancestor, Ferdinand Acoo, married into the same family that Edwin Horn did, so they are related to Lena Horne.
It's quite a legacy. We know in baseball that occasionally black teams and white teams would play each other, usually all-star affairs at the end of the season. But in basketball, it was a completely different scenario. They played long seasons against each other. Richard, your dad was part of those legendary battles between the original Celtics and the Wrens. What did he tell you about those years?
He told me that he really learned about segregation and racism through their rivalry. When the game was over at night, the Celtics would go back to whatever hotel they wanted to stay in whatever town they played in, and watch their friends board the luxury bus that Bobby Douglas had purchased for them because he knew they wouldn't be accommodated in those same hotels. The Celtics would go to whatever restaurant they wanted to and watch their friends bring food onto the bus, knowing that they wouldn't be served in those same restaurants. On 3 occasions, they left town in tandem, the Celtics in their Stutz Bearcats car, following the Wrens bus into a gas station to fuel up before the drive. only to watch the owner of the gas station come out with a rifle because he wasn't about to serve gas from his lily white pumps to this group of African-American players. There were actually 5 games that they played in, all in the Midwest, where there were actually race riots that took place during the games. Angry fans stormed the courts because they didn't want to see black and white players playing against each other. Basketball used to be called the net game, and I think a lot of people thought it was because of the net under the rim, but it was actually got its origin when owners of the arenas would build nets around the court to keep fans away from the players if violence was threatened. And I think the most telling thing about the relationship for me was that my dad and Tarzan Cooper wouldn't shake hands before every game, but would embrace each other because they wanted people in those stands to understand that for these Wrens and these Celtics, this wasn't just about a Hall of Fame basketball game, but it was also about what their vision was that America could someday become.
Yeah, their battles between Joe Lapchick and Tarzan Cooper, arguably two of the greatest centers of their era, were legendary for people who followed it. Satch, another piece of history that's lost really is you don't hear much in common conversation about when the game did integrate. You came in 1960, 10 years after the fact, but you came along in Boston only a year after the first African-American baseball player in that town. What legacy did those years of integrated play, now the teams weren't integrated, but the play between the teams, what did that do to foster relationships in the NBA by the time you got there?
Well, certainly for the Celtics, who had had Chuck Cooper come in and play, and then behind him Don Barksdale a couple of years later, the Celtics were thoroughly involved with, let's call it, the integration of the game. Auerbach was there, and Auerbach was only interested in lighting that victory cigar eventually. So for him, it was a matter of getting the best ball players. And so in '56, he was able to get Russell and add him to a team that had playoff possibilities. Then came Sam Jones, Casey Jones, and so on. So by the time I was there, I think you're talking about a Celtic team that had 4 and often 5 black players on the team, which put it way ahead in terms of all the other teams. I guess there was a lot of curiosity as to why the Celtics would have that many black players. But clearly, we were dominant in terms of the entire team, and it was a very satisfying relationship because Auerbach certainly got what he wanted, and that was to win.
Well, Satch, you guys are playing in a town that is, I mean, to put it kindly, has had significant trouble in its racial history over the years, especially through those years. What was the difference between the relationship you had with your teammates and your coaches and what it was like to play in that city in those years?
Well, it's interesting. Boston was, frankly, no different from all of the other cities in America that we visited, towns and cities. The problems, of course, in Boston were highlighted because of the school desegregation situations. But outside of that, wherever we went, Los Angeles, Houston, some of my worst experiences were in Los Angeles. So when people talk about how bad Boston was, it always makes me smile because you're talking about America and all of its cities. The travels were difficult. Some of the hotels and restaurants around the country were in the same situation, reluctant to serve, in many cases would not serve. So continuous problem across the entire country, though Boston has been the one that was highlighted.
Right. Mark, when you look back at the formation, I mean, this wasn't some time in the mid part of the century. I mean, we're going back 100 years now to when that first team was formed. The men who put it together, who were they? What was their background? What were they hoping to do with this?
Well, actually, today when we think of basketball, black basketball players, we always think of poverty-stricken inner-city kids. But the founding players of black basketball were actually members of the middle-class elite, where a lot of their parents, their grandparents were actually leaders of the African-American community. Like, for my instance, my ancestor, Ferdinand Koo, his father was a leader in the Black Republican Party, and he was a community leader. Another founder, Charles Scott-Ron, his grandfather was another leader in the African-American community, and he was an African-American inventor. He had several patents, U.S. patents, and he went to Cooper Union College. A lot of these members were actually members of what they called the black bourgeoisie, or Du Bois called them the talented 10th. They were pretty much the leaders of the African-American community, and they thought that they could establish basketball as a means to uplift the community. And they pretty much foresaw even the financial benefits that basketball could bring to the African-American community. You got to remember, this was 1906, 1910, 19 teens. And Ferdinand Adcoux, for instance, when after he played for the New York All-Stars, he then played for another pay-for-play team during the teens, and he may have been the first ever player president of a basketball team.
Richard, we saw in the piece about your father's efforts to integrate the league and the efforts he made to try to get black players with the Knicks. When he did make those efforts, when he did finally, get the ability to sign the players he wanted, like Sweetwater Clifton, what were those years like for him, and what were those years like for your family?
Well, he didn't talk about it so much at that time, but I remember my earliest memories as a child were looking outside our bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was raised, and seeing my father's image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing. And for several years after that, answering the phone, my dad not knowing I was listening, and it was nigger lover, nigger lover, nigger lover, directed at my dad. And I didn't know what it was all about, except I knew a lot of people didn't like this man who for me was my best friend, and we would talk about it later. And he'd never considered himself as any kind of social pioneer. He was just trying to sign the best basketball players available, no matter what they looked like or what they believed in, and that led to signing Sweetwater Clifton.
Well, it's funny that Satch just mentioned, of course, at Red Auerbach, that's what he wanted, was to win. But while your father wanted to do the same thing, how aware was he of the place in history he was going to take, and that the men he was going to sign in that team were going to take?
I think because of his experiences with the Wrens and playing against them, and also trying to bring the Wrens into the league in 1947, that he had that in his background, and I think it helped give him the kind of strength to move ahead no matter how many people were opposed to it. And of course, these things weren't being written in history, and you talked about in the beginning how come we didn't know about the Wrens. And I think the work that Mark is doing, and Claude, but also Kareem Abdul-Jabbar has a documentary coming out on the Wrens within the next month or so, and wrote a book called On the Shoulders of Giants that the movie's based on. I think those things are going to help us really get a clear picture of the contribution of the Wrens in that period in history.
Satch, when you joined the Celtics in 1960, they'd had a decade of experience at that point. What kind of lessons were passed on to you from the older African-American players on that team about what it was going to take to survive as a professional in that league?
Well, it's interesting because having Lapchick on the show, his father was also influential in my life by encouraging me to continue to play in the manner that I was playing. He was quite a gentleman. But, in coming up to the Celtics, one of the surprises I had, frankly speaking, was that they had been able to win 3 or 4 championships without me. And here I came in 60 and it just continued. You didn't want to be the ball player that comes to a team that's winning a championship and all of a sudden the team starts to lose. So that put additional pressure on you as far as the game is concerned and how you carried yourself in Boston. But we had great camaraderie with our teammates, very close associations. We went places, in places where certainly we were not served. Our players would band together and encourage us to do whatever we thought was necessary to handle the situations. My Boston Celtic experience were outstanding.
Satch, we've only got about 30 seconds left, but in that little bit of time, you've worked as a coach and as an administrator in this game for a long time. How aware are modern players of that piece of their history?
Well, I'll just give you a quick picture. We have in the NBA, we have a rookie program, and I remember sitting down with 2 or 3 players just in a session where we were just by ourselves, relaxing. And one of the questions from the players, you're talking about giving an insight into history, they wanted to know when did the NBA start to integrate basketball? But they were talking about from the perspective, when did they start letting white players play? So clearly, the young men were not aware at all that the league in its beginning and the BAA and the NBL and all those other leagues were really Irishmen, Jews, and many people, but certainly not including blacks. So historically, there's a lot of work to be done.
There is, and as Richard Lapchick was saying, we're going to get a little piece of that from the documentary film that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is working on. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Satch Sanders, Mark Morton, Richard Lapchick, thanks to all of you. Black History Month continues.